No one saw it coming. Not the audience gathered in a quiet church hall in Savannah, Georgia. Not the journalists waiting for their next headline. And certainly not Donald Trump, standing at the podium, expecting another evening of speeches and applause. Then, a 9-year-old girl stood up, clutching a worn, leather-bound Bible. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Mr. Trump, what does God mean to you?" The room froze. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the creak of chairs and the shuffle of feet disappeared. For the first time that evening, Trump didn't have an answer. A few minutes earlier, the atmosphere had been predictable. The small-town church hall buzzed with polite conversation. Folding chairs scraped against the polished floor as families, retirees, and churchgoers settled in, murmuring with quiet anticipation. Trump stood at the front, his presence commanding as always. His trademark gestures and confident tone filled the room, but something about him seemed different. Maybe it was the setting, far from the roaring stadiums of his usual campaign rallies, or maybe it was the crowd itself, filled with ordinary Americans rather than strategists or reporters. Emily, just 9 years old, sat among them. Her Sunday dress was neatly pressed, her brown hair tucked behind her ears, and her small hands gripped the Bible tightly. To most, she was just another child, dragged to an event she barely understood. But her mother, sitting beside her, knew better. "You can ask him," her mother had whispered before they arrived. "But only if you're brave enough, and only if you truly mean it." Emily had nodded, heart pounding. For weeks, she had rehearsed her question, scribbling it in her notebook during recess, whispering it under her breath at bedtime. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something she needed to understand. When the floor finally opened for questions, adults rushed forward, eager to ask about policies, jobs, and the latest headlines. Emily hesitated, shrinking in her chair. Then, her mother nudged her forward. Now or never. Her legs trembled as she stood, pressing the Bible against her chest. People noticed. The small girl, waiting patiently among a sea of towering adults. By the time she reached the microphone, the whispers had spread. Then, in a voice that trembled but refused to break, she asked the question that would change everything. "Mr. Trump, what does God mean to you?" And just like that, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. For a man known for his quick comebacks, Donald Trump didn't say a word. His expression didn't crack, but something in his posture shifted. A subtle hesitation, a flicker of uncertainty in his usually unshakable demeanor. The silence stretched. The audience, once buzzing with side conversations, now sat completely still. Even the journalists in the back, pens poised over notepads, stopped writing. The weight of Emily's question pressed down on the room like a held breath. Trump's gaze flickered downward, to the Bible clutched tightly in Emily's hands. His fingers tapped lightly against the podium. A habit, a thinking gesture. Still, no answer. Emily shifted on her feet. The microphone felt too tall now. The lights, too bright. She had imagined Trump flashing his famous smirk, launching into a powerful speech about faith and strength. Instead, he just stood there. Then, finally, he took a breath. "That's a big question," he said. His voice was lower than before, steadier. He exhaled, leaning slightly on the podium. "And it's not one I've always had the answer to." A ripple of surprise ran through the crowd. Trump? Admitting uncertainty? For the first time that evening, he wasn't a politician. He wasn't a businessman, a showman, or a former leader of the free world. He was just a man, standing in front of a child, trying to find the right words. Trump looked at Emily again, really looked at her. "When I was about your age," he said, "I had a lot of questions about God too." His voice softened, and the entire room leaned in. Trump's fingers drummed lightly on the podium. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, took on a distant look, as if he were seeing something long buried in memory. "Every Sunday morning, no matter what, my father took us to church." A faint smile flickered across his face, though it carried something heavier, nostalgia, maybe even longing. It wasn't a choice. It wasn't a discussion. Church was what we did. Rain or shine, sick or well, tired or wide awake. It didn't matter. Sunday meant church. A murmur of recognition rippled through the audience. Many had grown up the same way. Trump leaned slightly forward, his hands resting on the podium. I remember sitting in the pews, staring up at those stained glass windows. I'd watch the way the light filtered through, making patterns on the floor. And I'd listen, sort of. A few chuckles broke through the tension. I was a restless kid, always thinking about other things. Business ideas, baseball, whatever was going on in the world. But I'd hear bits and pieces. The pastor would talk about faith, about trusting God even when things didn't make sense. And every time, I'd ask myself the same thing. He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle over the room. How do you trust something you can't see? Emily blinked. For the first time, she saw something she hadn't expected, uncertainty. Not the kind of uncertainty that comes from avoiding an answer, but the kind that comes from someone who had wrestled with something real. Trump let the silence hang for a moment before continuing. My father, Fred Trump, he was a tough man, a strong man. He didn't talk about feelings much, but when it came to faith, he had this way of making things simple. I remember asking him once, "How do you know God is real?" And he just looked at me and said, "Faith is like a ladder." Trump glanced out at the crowd, his gaze sweeping over them as if making sure they were still with him. I was probably 8 or 9 at the time. I remember thinking, a ladder? What does that have to do with anything? But my father, he could tell I didn't understand. So, he explained it. He said, a ladder has steps. You don't jump to the top. You take it one step at a time. And sometimes, you're afraid you might fall. Sometimes, you don't even know where it's leading. But you climb anyway. Because if you stop climbing, you never get where you're supposed to be. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. I remember nodding like I got it, but I didn't. Not really. The room was silent again, but it wasn't the stunned silence from earlier. This was different. Emily's fingers loosened slightly on her Bible. She didn't dare interrupt, but something about Trump's voice told her there was more. Something deeper that hadn't been said yet. Trump's expression hardened slightly, his familiar confidence returning. But the truth is, he said, I didn't always climb that ladder. In fact, there were times I didn't even believe it was there. He let those words sink in. I know what people expect me to say, that I've always had faith, that I've never questioned it, never doubted. But that wouldn't be the truth. Emily's grip on her Bible tightened again. You want to know what God means to me? Trump asked, his voice low but firm. For a long time, I didn't know. I wasn't sure if he was there, if he was listening. And even if he was, I wasn't sure he cared. A hush fell over the crowd. For the first time all night, Donald Trump didn't sound like a man delivering a speech. He sounded like a man telling the truth. Trump's fingers tightened slightly around the podium. His voice, steady but lower than before, carried a weight that wasn't there moments ago. There's something I don't talk about often, he said, scanning the faces in the audience. Something that changed me. Something that made me look at faith, at God, differently. The church hall was still. Even the reporters in the back, usually half distracted, were locked in. Emily barely blinked. She wasn't sure why, but she felt that whatever he was about to say, it mattered. Trump exhaled. My brother, Fred. He was a good man. The best, really. He had something that I never had. A kind of warmth, a kindness, a way of making people feel like they mattered. He paused, then added, almost like a confession, he was nothing like me. A few people in the crowd smiled softly at that. He wasn't built for the fight. Not the way I was. He didn't want to compete, didn't care about power, about business. He just wanted to be happy. He wanted a simple life. Trump looked down, his hands now resting on the podium. But life isn't always kind to people like Fred. The audience remained silent, hanging on every word. He struggled. With drinking. With finding his place. And no matter what I said, no matter how much I told him to toughen up, he just wasn't like that. He wasn't built that way. His jaw clenched slightly, a flicker of something deeper passing through his eyes. And then, he continued, his voice quieter. One day, he was gone. A few gasps were barely audible over the hush in the room. Emily felt something tighten in her chest. When Fred died, I was angry. More than anything, I was angry. At him. At the world. At God. His grip on the podium tightened. I remember thinking, why him? Why not someone else? Why take the guy who never hurt a soul? It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. The rawness in his voice was something rare, something unexpected. I didn't talk about it, Trump admitted. Not much. I didn't want to deal with it. So I did what I always do. I kept moving. I focused on work, on winning, on proving something to the world. He shook his head. But the thing about grief, it doesn't care how strong you are. It doesn't care how tough you think you are. It follows you. Emily swallowed hard, her hands tightening around the worn edges of her Bible. And for a long time, Trump said, his voice quieter now, I felt like I was walking alone. The weight of those words settled over the audience like a heavy fog. I stopped going to church. I stopped praying. I figured, what was the point? If God was real, if he was listening, he sure wasn't listening to me. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, others shifted uncomfortably. And then, Trump continued, his voice carrying something different now, something softer. Something happened. He let the words linger, letting the audience lean in. It was just a dream, he admitted. Or maybe it wasn't. I don't know. But one night, after months of feeling nothing, no faith, no belief, just emptiness, I saw him. Emily's breath caught. Fred, Trump said, standing there, clear as day, smiling. That same goofy smile he always had when he was up to something. A few people chuckled softly, but the moment was thick with emotion. And he looked at me, Trump continued, just looked at me, like he always did. And then he said one thing, just one. The church was so quiet that even the faintest shuffle of feet seemed loud. Trump exhaled. Don't be angry, Dawn. You've got work to do. Emily felt her chest tighten. Trump shook his head slightly, as if still trying to understand it himself. I woke up, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something. He let the silence settle, then continued. I don't know if it was God. I don't know if it was just my mind trying to make sense of things. But I do know this. I stopped asking why. I stopped demanding answers. I stopped trying to make sense of things that maybe, just maybe, aren't supposed to make sense. His gaze lifted, sweeping over the crowd. And that's when I understood what my father meant. About the latter. Emily's fingers curled around the pages of her Bible. Faith isn't about understanding, Trump said. It's about climbing anyway, even when it doesn't make sense, even when it hurts, even when you don't know where it leads. A woman in the front row wiped her eyes. A man near the back cleared his throat. Emily felt something shift inside her, something she couldn't quite name. Trump straightened, his voice firm but not loud. I don't have all the answers, he admitted. I don't know why some people get taken too soon. I don't know why good people suffer. But I do know this. God gives us work to do. And when you stop asking why, when you just start climbing, that's when you start to see it. His gaze settled back on Emily. And that, he said, is what God means to me. The room was still. Not out of discomfort, not out of hesitation, but because, in that moment, no one wanted to break it. A single tear slipped down Emily's cheek. She didn't sob. She didn't make a sound. She just stood there, small and still, gripping the worn Bible as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Trump noticed. He saw the way her hands trembled, how she blinked rapidly, trying to hold back more tears. She was just a child, but something about her reaction struck him deeper than any question he had ever been asked on a stage. Then, her voice, soft, unsteady, but clear. My grandma used to say, God always listens, even if you don't hear him. The words hung in the air, delicate but powerful. Trump's expression, usually sharp and controlled, softened in a way that felt unfamiliar. He looked at her, not as an audience member, not as a question to answer, but as a little girl searching for something real. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Heads nodded. A few sniffles broke the silence. An older woman sitting near the front clutched her cross necklace, squeezing it as if drawing strength from the weight of it. A man in the back, a working man, the kind with calloused hands and tired eyes, rubbed his jaw, looking down at his lap. Trump finally spoke, but his voice had lost its edge. Your grandma was a very wise woman. Emily nodded, her lips pressing together as she wiped at her face. For a long moment, the hall was filled with nothing but quiet breathing and the occasional shuffle of a chair. It wasn't an awkward silence. It wasn't empty. It was full. Full of things people had been afraid to say. Full of grief, of questions, of longing. And then, someone spoke. "I lost my son 2 years ago." The voice came from a middle-aged woman in the second row, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked nervous, as if she hadn't planned to speak. But now, the words were pouring out of her. He was only 20, a good kid, never got into trouble, never hurt anyone. And then, her voice caught, and she swallowed hard. And then one day, he was just gone. The room remained completely still. Emily turned toward the woman, her teary eyes filled with something deeper than sympathy, understanding. The woman continued, her fingers twisting the fabric of her sleeve. "I prayed every night. Every single night. I asked God to protect him. And when he died, I thought, what was the point? What was the point of all those prayers if he wasn't listening?" Trump nodded slowly. He understood that kind of anger. For a long time, he had felt it too. Another voice. A man this time. His voice was deep, rough, like someone who had spent a lifetime working with his hands. "I walked away from God a long time ago," he admitted. "Grew up in the church. Did everything right. But when my wife got sick, when I lost her," he exhaled sharply. "I couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't sit in a pew and listen to people say, 'God has a plan.'" Someone else nodded. Then another. It was as if Emily's question had opened something. A door people had kept shut for too long. Doubts. Anger. Questions that had never found answers. Emily's small voice rose again, this time more certain. Maybe God was listening. Maybe we just don't always understand what he's saying." The woman in the second row let out a quiet sob, covering her mouth with her hands. Trump's eyes flickered toward Emily. There was something about this little girl, something rare. He cleared his throat. "You know," he said, looking out at the crowd, "I think sometimes we expect faith to feel a certain way. We think that if we believe hard enough, if we pray enough, we'll feel something. Peace, clarity, maybe even answers." He shook his head. But faith isn't a feeling. It's not something that just shows up when life is easy. It's a choice. Every single day, it's a choice. The audience listened like they never had before. Trump wasn't preaching. He wasn't debating. He was talking to them. Talking to the woman who had lost her son. Talking to the man who had buried his wife. Talking to Emily, whose small hands gripped the words of a grandmother who still felt close, even though she was gone. "Some of the strongest people I've ever met," Trump continued, "are the ones who kept their faith even when it didn't make sense. Even when they were angry. Even when they thought God had abandoned them." He paused, then looked back at Emily. "And I think your grandma was right," he said. "I think God is always listening, even when we can't hear him." Emily's face brightened, just a little. The older woman in the front row whispered something under her breath, barely audible. A prayer. The man who had lost his wife sat straighter in his chair, staring at his hands. Something was shifting in the room. Not just words. Something deeper. Something that couldn't be explained, only felt. Then, the woman in the second row, the one who had lost her son, nodded slowly. "I want to believe that," she whispered. "I really do." Emily turned toward her. "Maybe you don't have to believe it all at once," she said softly. "Maybe you just take it one step at a time." Trump inhaled sharply. A ladder. His father's words, spoken decades ago, echoed in his mind. You don't jump to the top. You take it one step at a time. He looked at Emily, then back at the crowd. "I think," Trump said carefully, "that's the best definition of faith I've ever heard." The room was quiet again, but it wasn't a heavy quiet. It was the kind of quiet that comes when people have felt something real. The kind of quiet that lingers not with doubt, but with hope. Emily smiled. Just a little. A deep voice broke the quiet. "Mr. Trump, are you ever afraid to admit your weaknesses?" Trump's gaze shifted toward the man in the back. For a moment, he was silent. Then, a small smirk appeared. "That's a good one," he said, tapping the podium. "I don't think anyone's ever asked me that before." The man stayed serious. He wanted the truth. Trump nodded, his tone shifting. People think strength is never showing weakness. But real strength? It's pushing forward even when you feel weak. The room stayed silent. Everyone has doubts. Most people hide them. But faith? Faith is choosing to keep going, even when you don't understand. A murmur of understanding spread through the audience. Then, a soft voice. I lost my husband last year. A woman in the third row sat stiffly, her hands clenched in her lap. We were married 53 years. I prayed every day. And then one morning, he was gone. Since then, I don't know if I believe anymore. Emily watched her, eyes filled with something deeper than sympathy, understanding. Trump's voice softened. I think a lot of people feel that way. The woman's fingers tightened on her dress. Faith doesn't disappear, he said. Sometimes life buries it under pain, but it's still there. He leaned forward. And one day, when you least expect it, you'll realize it never really left. It was just waiting. The woman exhaled shakily. I want to believe that. Trump nodded. Then start there. You don't have to have all the answers. Just take the first step. A single tear slipped down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. She just nodded. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was full. Full of things people had been afraid to say. Full of grief, of longing, and full of something else, hope. Trump rested his hands on the podium. People think faith is about big things, big moments. But I don't think that's it. He shook his head. Faith is in the small things, the quiet moments, the choices no one sees. His eyes settled on Emily. It's in a little girl brave enough to ask a question most adults wouldn't dare to. Emily's cheeks flushed. It's in a wife getting out of bed after losing her husband, even when it feels impossible. The older woman pressed a hand to her chest. It's in a man who thinks he lost his faith, but still looks for it anyway. Trump's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Faith isn't loud, he said. It's not something you prove. It's something you live. Applause erupted, not polite, but real. Trump turned back to Emily. You started all of this, he said, his voice softer. That was a tough question, kid. Emily swallowed hard. Thank you for asking it. And just like that, he stepped back. The moment was over. But it wasn't, because it no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the people in that room. The woman clutching her necklace, the man staring at his hands, those who came expecting one thing but left with something entirely different. It belonged to Emily. Her mother's hand rested on her shoulder. Emily turned, looking up at her. Her mother didn't need to say anything. Emily already knew. She swallowed. Grandma would be proud of me. Her mother's eyes shone. She nodded. More than proud, sweetheart. She would be amazed. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on your faith and share it with someone who may need it today. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel.